Welcome to our April edition of the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility webinars. This month's topic is 1 year later, COVID-19, transit, and shared mobility. Just a little background on our webinar series. This is a program created through our Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility program that I am the head of. My name is Elliot McFadden, the Greater Minnesota Shared Mobility Coordinator, and I work in the Office of Transit and Active Transportation. And we are doing these webinars to increase familiarity with shared mobility technologies and services in Greater Minnesota for transit agencies and transportation planners, as well as interested stakeholders in the community. And this is a platform for knowledge sharing. So we are going to continue to bring you new ideas and different projects that are happening both in Minnesota and around the country to help you learn more. Webinars are scheduled moving forward on Wednesdays, the second Wednesdays of the month at 11 a.m. We're starting a little later today to accommodate another training, but normally we start at 11 a.m. So the next webinar will be Wednesday, May 12th at 11. We are finalizing the subject for that. So if you are on the invitee list for this webinar, you will be getting an invitation to that webinar, and you'll find out when that goes out what the subject will be. And if there's anyone on your staff or in your organization that you would like to have included in the invitation, please feel free to send me an email to elliot.mcfadden@state.mn.us, and I will be happy to add them to the invitation list. And with that, we will go ahead and move forward with our subject matter today, which is COVID 1 year later. And we will go ahead and start with a presentation from Dr. Susie Pike from the University of California, Davis, who has done some research in this area. And with that, go ahead and take it away, Susie.
Sorry about that. Can you see my screen?
We can see it.
Okay, I just can't see it, so it's just a little different for me. Okay, great. So good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Elliot, for including me in today's webinar. I'm excited to talk about this project that I've been working on for the past couple of years. It's really a project focused on ride-hailing partnerships. So when transit agencies partner with companies like Uber and Lyft to do things like providing first and last mile service, or to provide service maybe late at night or on weekends when transit service is less frequent or stops. And so we've been exploring a number of questions related to these partnerships. At first, we were really focused around this question of what motivates partnerships. And so noting that, they seem very prevalent, but really it's only a small number of transit agencies that are really forming these partnerships and carrying them out and providing services through them. So what is it about those agencies that really motivates them and leads them to form these partnerships and the related programs? And then we have also been interested in just understanding that process. So do agencies conduct any research or reach out to other transit agencies, or just only learn from the private partners like Uber and Lyft when they're planning these partnerships? And then other questions that we were looking at here include, what are the necessary conditions for partnerships to form? And then, are there barriers that prevent transit agencies from pursuing or ultimately forming these partnerships? And so the first 2 years of this project, we've really been focused on these questions. And we, as a team, I have a grad student, Sada Kazemian, and then actually an undergrad named Kaylee Flynn, who have both been working with me on this project. So I just wanted to briefly kind of go through. The study has involved now 3 surveys, but 2 surveys, one in 2018, which was with only transit agencies that had partnerships. So that first survey was really trying to understand that kind of process leading up to partnership formation, the role of information sharing. Then we built on that with some interviews, again, primarily with agencies that had partnerships. But here we started to talk a little bit more with agencies also that don't have partnerships. And we started to think more about, well, what we really want to know, if what we really want to know is what leads to partnership formation, we need to talk with and survey transit agencies that don't have these partnerships as well to understand whether there's an interest, but there are just barriers, or maybe there's not an interest as broadly as it may seem. And so then we did a second survey in 2019, and that survey had both agencies with and without partnerships. And so some of the key findings from these early stages of the study included that partnerships, in order to form and progress, really need a good amount of communication and research kind of at the outset of the planning stage. So we found a lot of communication between agencies. So when an agency is considering a partnership, they reach out to those that have done them before to ask about their experiences. And interestingly, a lot of that, those conversations revolved around the relationship with the private sector partner, with the Uber or Lyft. Not so much, there to some extent, yes, on the program details and what was working and not working, but really each context is so different but the contracting and that relationship were something that transit agencies really felt that they were learning a lot about, and the agencies we talked to that had partnerships who were reached out to also said that that was one of the resources they would share contract information often. And then another piece of the puzzle seemed to be champions. So having someone within or connected to the transit agency, and these are all quotes from the interviews, who were really motivated to see the partnership happen and to carry it through. And without that, it seemed that it was unlikely for a partnership really to ultimately form and have a program associated with it. Of course, funding is necessary. And then we asked about support. So how much support within the agency, how much support from the board, from the general public within the area. Higher support seemed to be connected to a higher likelihood of partnership. And then similarly, we asked every agency about concerns that they had related to partnerships. And those agencies with fewer concerns tended to be the ones that were forming partnerships. And so I'll talk a little bit more about this in the context of COVID as well. And then, most of the partnerships that we observed were for first and last mile connections, although certainly that's not the only format that they can take. So this is all kind of background on what we had found leading up to COVID. And so now when COVID comes into the picture, we have a little bit of a different story. So we conducted another survey this past fall, and again, reaching out to agencies both with and without partnerships. Here we tried to do a much bigger sample. We kind of have a sense of the lay of the land. And so we sent out invitations to over 400 transit agencies. We got about 80 participants, and mostly from rural agencies. So that does make a difference. A lot of our analysis is focused on the differences between urban and rural agencies. And here, only 10 of them, so only a small percentage, had partnerships. So we're really starting to understand more about what the issues are for agencies that either aren't interested or feel that there are barriers to pursuing these partnerships. We also, in addition to asking about partnerships, we also asked about some other innovations, and we asked about the impacts of COVID. So by and large, our respondents said that they reduced service and also had reduced fare sales as impacts of COVID. And then agencies have been responding to COVID by doing things like mask requirements and onboard social distancing. So a huge majority of the agencies doing those things. And then some other things like increasing service. And that question actually said specifically in areas where there was a higher need, right? So for essential workers, for example, so increasing service along those routes, or adding vehicles along routes that still had a fairly high demand in order to enable greater social distancing, right? So putting more vehicles through. And then I didn't note this earlier, but one of the things that we found in our earlier research was that it seemed to not matter, or it seemed that there weren't special kind of challenges or conditions that those agencies that pursued partnerships were facing. So the challenges faced by transit agencies are fairly similar. Is there? Okay, thought I heard some noise.
Yep, you're good.
Okay, thank you. So the challenges that are faced by transit agencies are fairly similar across the board. And that's one of the reasons is that we wanted to dig deeper into this question of, well, if transit agencies tend to face, service cost challenges and ridership challenges, but some pursue partnerships and some don't. What else is going on there? It's not just to meet a specific need or challenge. And then this table, this chart, to show really that the challenges that transit agencies faced leading up to COVID were really intensified by COVID. So more agencies reporting during COVID that they had service cost challenges, more agencies reporting ridership and low performing route challenges. And then of course, the cleanliness perception, right? One of the, early on in COVID, we were hearing about, the studies and evaluation of, COVID being present in New York City transit systems. And that certainly has led to perceptions about the cleanliness or the possible transfer of COVID in public transit. So another challenge that they're facing now. And then we kind of then also focused in back on this question of partnerships and other innovations that transit agencies may have pursued in response to COVID. So here we asked whether they had considered any of these sort of innovative activities before COVID or during COVID. And interestingly, the ride-hail partnerships was lower on the list, so much less frequently considered than other kinds of activities or innovative activities such as touchless payment or fare-free transit, on-demand service, and mobile ticketing were all considered more before COVID, and then more also during COVID. And, it's interesting to me also that we see these upticks in the consideration of fare-free transit, right? Because that allows less contact between passengers and drivers, and then mobile ticketing as well. So both of those kind of provide these contactless options. And those are also things that it's fairly easy for a transit agency to adopt and implement on their own. Things like touchless payment require more investment of technology in order to carry them out. So I think that that's kind of the main reason that we see less for the touchless payment. And then on-demand service, again, it requires a little more effort to either implement new service or to reroute vehicles. So I think that's why those two we see a little bit less. Okay, and then as I noted before, we found that the agencies that weren't pursuing partnerships had higher numbers of challenges that they reported. And so I didn't mention this before, but we saw that was also related to driver activities and then drug and alcohol testing. And we found that again was the case still during COVID, that these were challenges that transit agencies identified as potential barriers to forming partnerships or issues that came up in conversations about the potential for partnerships. And so really things related to driving. Drug and alcohol testing is an interesting question because a lot of it has to do with a lack of clarity on some level about what the regulations are and then how they can be applied in a partnership and a program that uses ride hailing and then could use taxi services in order to kind of address the drug and alcohol testing question. But the information hasn't been known in the same way across the board for transit agencies. So that's been an interesting one. Cost effectiveness, another concern. And then also data sharing and vehicle accessibility. So all of these things fairly high up in terms of the number of agencies that report that as a challenge. And not surprising, I guess, given some of the things that I have already noted about our respondents during COVID, that partnerships seem to have a lower level of support than some of the other activities. So before I showed, whether they were being considered or not, and so this should be directly related to that, whether or not there's much support within the transit agency. And I do note here that this chart shows the level of support within the transit agency before COVID-19, but we did some analysis to see how much levels of support had changed from before COVID to during COVID for these different innovations, and the changes were very small. They weren't non-existent, but they were very small. So it's the before level of support is a fairly good predictor of the during level of support. And again, we see that lower level of support for partnerships and the other kinds of innovations or activities that may be more directly related to solving challenges related to COVID specifically see a higher level of support. So kind of brings me back to this question, not just what transit agencies pursue partnerships and don't pursue partnerships, but can partnerships really help transit agencies, and will they help them? And I think what I have kind of settled on as my current answer to this question really is yes, I think they can if they want them. I didn't talk about this here, but in our first survey, we asked the agencies that had partnerships what criteria they used to evaluate them. And the top two were cost effectiveness and then ridership. And they couldn't evaluate ridership maybe as well because of data sharing issues. But the cost effectiveness, those that said they valued that as a criteria all said that they felt like they had been successful in that area. And so yes, I think in the cases that we've seen, the partnerships have been successful, but we need to be thinking about some of these other findings that we've had, which really relate to the challenges, a particular challenge maybe not being the impetus for a partnership starting, that there might be other factors like a desire for innovation or really the presence of a champion who's interested in the partnership. Yeah, so some of the things that are required here, as I mentioned, a champion, reaching out, having support, and then the number of concerns really seeming to be a key barrier. And then that, it's not necessarily that transit agencies aren't interested in change or aren't innovative. They've responded to COVID amazingly and done a lot of different things, throughout the country. And then COVID hasn't really increased an interest in partnerships. And I will say that, this survey we did in October of last year, and I do, kind of anecdotally have heard that maybe there's an uptick now in partnerships forming as a way to get people a little bit more comfortable, get people kind of back to using shared modes by having them use services like Uber and Lyft maybe instead of transit. And so I'll be kind of following that trend and looking into it a little bit more as far as what's happened in the past 6 months, because things have changed so quickly during COVID. So yeah, so that is what I have for today. Thank you so much again. And I'll kind of check in the chat for questions, and then I'm looking forward to hearing the other presenters this morning.
Thank you so much, Susie. This was great. Now we are. Hold on. There we go. Now we're going to go ahead and move on to Scudder Wag. He is with Jarrett Walker and Associates and works with transit agencies across the country. And if you will give me just a moment, I will load up your slides and drive for you, okay?
Thanks for being in the driver's seat, Elliot, with the my technical difficulties on my end. So I just wanted to talk quickly about, how has the pandemic shaped some key transit trade-offs. Any of you who may be familiar with the work that we at Jarrett Walker and Associates do in communities across the country is we try to very carefully talk about value trade-offs in transit, since so many key choices in transit are about what communities want a transit system to do to balance between different priorities that many people share but lead you in different directions. And so, next slide. Couple of technical things to think about that have obviously been a significant challenge. Driver shortages have been a problem across the industry for quite a while. It seems to have been exacerbated for some agencies during COVID due to many drivers needing to be home with children or take care of sick relatives, or difficulty with getting new drivers in the door to operate vehicles. So hopefully, as we come out of COVID, that challenge may start to ameliorate. We'll see. It also may worsen somewhat due to just the high demand for commercial drivers in general right now, with so much of us doing online shopping and the enormous increase in delivery services. So that's one technical issue. Changes in fare expectations is another big one. Many agencies have went fare free during COVID. Many have brought back fares, but many have started to ask the question about, should we charge fares at all going forward? And that raises some technical questions about your fare collections versus your fare collection costs versus fare revenues, but also technically the question of demand if you maintained a fare-free service in a post-COVID world, but also on the demand side, what that might mean for ADA service demand and costs going forward. But then there's just a larger value question about what is it the community wants transit to do, because being fare-free would potentially mean less dollars for additional service or other factors. But the thing I want to talk about most is managing service levels and responsiveness to changes in demand that has kind of whipsawed transit agencies across the country through this. So next slide. It's been a tough time in the last year for transit. Ridership and revenue drops were enormous early on. Many agencies have seen some return. Many of you working in smaller towns and more rural agencies have probably seen ridership return closer to more normal levels, as opposed to agencies in very large cities that have been more reliant on office people who ride for commute trips, where ridership has not come back nearly as dramatically. The funding needs from the initial CARES Act was sort of a challenge in many larger agencies not getting a significant chunk. That's been ameliorated somewhat by the more recent relief funding. And a lot of these factors have kind of exacerbated some transit planning trade-offs, but also made some a little bit easier to deal with. But it's also been an interesting time to help change perceptions and assumptions about what it is transit's trying to achieve in communities. Because in many communities, there's been an assumption that transit's trying to always get as many riders as possible, which is, a very important goal. But we've been talking a lot more through the pandemic about the essential role that transit plays in keeping our economies running and keeping our civilizations running, by being there for the essential workers many who do not have cars, and many of whom, provide the services that we all need to keep operating on a daily basis: grocery workers, healthcare workers, and others. Next slide. So one of the trade-offs that we often talk about with communities is the peak versus all day trade-off. Peak service is generally much more expensive than all day, all week service. Extra vehicles that you have to own and store just to run 3 to 6 hours a day, split shifts, the empty buses that you have because of off-peak, having to run buses in the off-peak direction for deadheading or for off-peak directionality. So there's always been a challenge in transit particularly in places with heavy commute flows, of the extra cost of peak service being so significant and potentially forcing agencies to cut back for evenings, weekends, and others to try to meet that demand, and whether that is the right thing to do. Next slide. And for many agencies, the peak market has just completely evaporated, or significantly evaporated during the pandemic, because so many office workers have been working from home. I'm still working from home. I'm sure many of you are. And so the graph on the right here is from Transit app and their tracking of transit usage through their app. And the green line being a normal Monday across all of the tracking they do in the cities they operate in with their service, versus a Monday in May, the light green line, where you see almost no big difference between the midday and the peak, and also just an enormous drop in overall demand. And we've seen some comeback from that. If you go to the next slide. So this is that same graph from May of last year, and then go ahead. Next slide. You see, this is just this past Monday. We see that demand creeping back up. We see those peaks coming back somewhat, but still the ratio of peak to base not being nearly as dramatic, which in some ways makes it a bit easier for transit agencies to manage by providing a more consistent schedule across the whole day. Next slide. And we see this in patterns of activity. This is some analysis from our work in Chicago, where the routes 120 to 143 at the bottom of this chart are showing you the enormous decreases in ridership on peak focused services and commute focused services, versus the rest of the network, where ridership loss was much less significant, and for all day, all week routes. Next slide. So one of the transit trade-offs that has potentially been made easier here during COVID is this simplicity of not having nearly as much of a peak to base problem, and some agencies shifting to just a straightforward all day, all week schedule and service pattern, which is much easier for riders to understand, much simpler for operator scheduling, is probably cheaper, and ultimately long term would be a higher ridership thing to do relative to cost. In the network redesign processes we've done, like in Houston and Richmond, they saw major improvements in weekend ridership from improved weekend service, which is something you can do if you're not spending so much on peak. As we recover from COVID, we will have to see how this evolves. Will demand at peak times come back to where it was before? Many of us think it may not reach quite the same level as it did because of much more flexibility for office workers. But it's certainly something we will track across the industry. But it would certainly make a transit manager's and a service planner's job much simpler if that peak to base level was much flatter going long term. Next slide. As we talk about in most every community we work in, there's always this trade-off between ridership and coverage, and whether you emphasize more frequent service in the busiest places to get a lot of people riding transit, versus how much do you spread your service out all over the place to get to as many people as possible, to provide service to every taxpayer, to provide service to every city or town or electoral district, and be that lifeline. And in service planning, these goals are ultimately in conflict. And thinking about that in the time of the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, next slide, the basic access is obviously very critical during the pandemic. The decrease in demand has made it somewhat easier to manage that ridership coverage challenge during the pandemic. As demand has come down, it has been somewhat easier to manage being able to keep coverage services available. But the interesting pattern is that in many, many communities, the frequent services, the trunk line frequent services in many communities, have been the ones that have seen the most significant ridership overall. And the more coverage-oriented services, the lower frequency services, have tended to be the ones that have seen the most significant decrease in a lot of places. It varies a lot across community, but That's a pattern we've seen in many places that we have been assisting through the pandemic. And that's raised a question about, in a time of kind of crisis like we've been working through in the pandemic, what are the most strategic things you can do to manage your resources? And that's why we've worked with a number of communities to help them kind of map out what is that essential network of service that kind of no matter what happens, they would run, and thinking about it in terms of access and that ridership versus coverage process. The next slide. So an essential network is basically what is that kind of minimum viable, useful transit service that you would provide in a crisis condition. And it can go beyond the thinking about a pandemic. A driver shortage or strike, a major weather event. For many of you in Minnesota, probably major snow events. You think about this, you may already have snow routes. But this helps everyone, including the community, think about, in a crisis, how can transit be like a dimmer switch in terms of turning down service in places and ways that can still be enormously useful for most people as you manage that crisis. So next slide. In Miami-Dade last year, in the process of helping them redesign their bus network, we developed this redesigned network for them and color-coded by frequency, red being the most frequent routes and blue being 30-minute routes and teal being 60-minute routes. And you can see a broad and very useful network for most of the dense parts of the county. Next slide. Sorry. But we also helped them and the community think about what would you do in a crisis situation if you had to significantly cut back service, say a driver shortage, a hurricane in their case, and others, and help them develop this tier 1 network, this kind of essential minimum network that in a situation where they had to cut back by 30 to 40% potentially, here's how you could do so while maintaining as much access as possible for as many people as possible, even if walks were a good bit longer or new connections might be required in order to get places, but it would still significantly serve a lot of job centers, significantly serve a lot of population with reasonably frequent service so people could get places in a reasonable amount of time. So this has been a process, and if you, next slide, no, oh yeah, keep this up, sorry. Go back for a moment. So in looking actually at this network, one of the things we've been able to help them see is that a network like this, even though it actually cuts back a number of routes in the system, by maintaining a reasonably frequent service across every half a mile in their core, the alternative of just turning down everything in their existing network by 30 to 40%, this network means 51% more jobs are reachable in an hour by most people on average in the county relative to the alternative. So it helps them, give them that dimmer switch of thinking about how do you manage your network, your service in a crisis, both during this pandemic and long term in any future crisis. So I hope that helps you all think about kind of different ways that the pandemic is giving us challenges and opportunities to prepare for the future. And my email, phone, and Twitter are there if you all want to reach out to me in any way, and look forward to your questions later.
Thank you so much. That's a lot of very useful information and ways of thinking of things, a lot to chew on there. And we will, as I said, we'll have the slides available online too if people want to go back and take a look at that. I do encourage folks, if they have any questions or comments, you can put that in the chat box, and we will be getting to that at the end of the webinar. Our last speaker is Dr. Yingling Fan from the University of Minnesota at the Humphrey School. I'm excited to introduce Yingling because she and her research team are working on a project with us in the Office of Transit and Active Transportation to look at in greater Minnesota the impacts of COVID and strategies your agencies and partners can be looking at to improve ridership. So I will let her take it from here, but just know that not only is this an interesting project for you to hear about, but you're going to have a role in helping to craft this research. So expect to be hearing more about this in the coming months. Take it away, Yingling.
All right, thank you, Elliot, for the introduction. Just want to check that you are able to see my screen, the slides.
Yes, we can see it.
Okay, thank you. So good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present about this project, and which is ongoing, and we just started this January. And the project title is Understanding Post-COVID Safety Concerns Towards the Use of Transit, Shared Mobility, and Connected and Automotive Vehicles in the Greater Minnesota. So our focus is the Greater Minnesota, and I really appreciate this opportunity to present because many of you will become our survey respondents. So I hope that we will send out the recruitment emails and hopefully that you can fill out our survey about the safety protocols that had been implemented during COVID. I want to first talk about our research team. Myself is the principal investigator of this project. I have 3 co-investigators. Dr. Xinyi Chen, who is the interim director at the UMN Tourism Center, which is a part of the UMN extension, and her work her work focuses on the Greater Minnesota. Also, Neil Linschild, his work also focuses on the Greater Minnesota. He is an extension educator at the Center for Community Vitality. And we also have Galen Ryan, who is a research fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs on the project. The research objective is twofold. We want to investigate the perceived COVID-19 safety risks and barriers that might prevent transit and shared mobility services to attract post-COVID riders in Greater Minnesota. And in order to investigate the risks and barriers that prevent the return of transit and shared mobility ridership, we want to look into the mismatch. Basically, we want to survey the potential transit and shared mobility riders, but we also want to survey the transit and the shared mobility providers. So for the transit and shared mobility providers, we want to check that what are the safety measures and the protocols in place to address the COVID-19 safety risks and barriers. And then from the rider's perspective, we want to survey and investigate that what are their safety perceptions and preferences. And then with the investigation around both transit riders as well as providers, we want to develop strategies for existing and future mobility providers in rural and small town areas in the Greater Minnesota to accelerate the return of transit and shared mobility ridership. And this project is much needed. This is the public transit ridership losses at the national level, and across the nation, I think many agencies are seeing similar level of decline. So we are looking at data, 2 years of data here, and you can see that clearly that in early 2020, that is a significant decline due to the COVID-19 situation and the lockdown measures implemented across the nation. And starting May, kind of like you can see that transit actually, the ridership is increasing slowly. And we anticipated that this increasing trend will continue, but it's very important that for transit agencies to think about how we can get the return, get the ridership at the level that is the pre-COVID level. And I just want to give you some historical context that how significant this ridership decline is. So historically that we've seen similar level of decline in 1920s as well as post-World War II in 1950s and 60s. You know, a lot of the, you know, after 1960s that the federal government invested significantly in the transit industry, and we were able to have kind of modest ridership increase after those two significant decreases in the history. So I'm not saying that what the situation we face is similar to the historical declines that we had, but the level of ridership loss is kind of similar to what we had back in 1920s as well as post-World War II. So we definitely needed to invest significantly in terms of our efforts thinking about the strategies to accelerate ridership return. The project timeline, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we don't have results yet. We just began our project in January 2021. And the first task is develop a public inventory of the safety protocols implemented by transit agencies as well as shared mobility providers. And we're going to develop this inventory using a survey of transit agencies. So I was very excited to hear about Dr. Susan Pike's study where they also did a survey among transit agencies. Our survey, the content of our survey will be quite different because we're going to focus on the administrative policies and protocols implemented that had been implemented by transit agencies as well as shared mobility providers. And the time frame that we're going to focus on is actually the first quarter of 2021. So it's going to be retrospective, and you know, we survey transit agencies and shared mobility providers the policies they had put in place for the first quarter of 2021. And then the second task is the survey development. It's a little bit confusing due to the name of the task, the second task. This survey is actually the survey of potential transit riders as well as shared mobility riders. So we are not looking at a survey of transit agencies or shared mobility providers. We're going to recruit residents in the greater Minnesota to participate in this task 2 survey. And then we will implement the survey and do the analysis of the survey. And then finally develop, very important to develop action plans for rural transit agencies as well as small town transit agencies and shared mobility providers to strategize and you know, recommend policies and measures that they could implement to accelerate ridership return. So this will just to give you, I want to give you a quick update of where we are in terms of task 1. So as I mentioned earlier, in order to develop this inventory, and we want to collect standardized information from each transit agency, we will have a you know, separate inventory for the shared mobility providers. So the transit agency data will be, we will get it through a safety protocol survey that will be distributed among transit agencies. The National Transit Database at the Federal Transit Administration, at the federal FTA, you know, they have a very comprehensive database of transit agencies in the United States. So we anticipate to distribute this survey among those transit agencies. And a novel component of this survey is that we're going to have a map-based inventory. Basically, as soon as a transit agency, as soon as a transit agency staff person fill out the survey, they will be directed to a map-based inventory, and they will be able to review their survey results as well as check out the existing survey responses through that publicly available map So on the map, it will show what are the transit agencies that already completed the survey, and then people who completed the survey and the people who haven't completed the survey can go to the map and check out, the survey information about, survey protocols implemented at those transit agencies. So our hope is that this map-based inventory kind of is a part of the reward for the people who will contribute to information to, and provide survey responses. We would appreciate that you could fill out this survey when it's available. We anticipate that the survey will be distributed in early May, so very soon. And at the same time, the online map-based inventory will be available as well. And then going to task 2. So again, task 2 is very different from task 1. Here, the online survey, we are focusing on potential riders. And we anticipate our target sample size is 1,000 residents from the greater Minnesota area. And we will ensure that our respondents will have diverse social demographic backgrounds. And to do so, our enrollment strategy is twofold. We're going to rely upon the Qualtrics online sampling method, as well as the social media based sampling method. So the Qualtrics online sampling, basically that they are able to ensure a sample meet a predetermined demographic criteria. So we had experience using Qualtrics in our other projects where we can tell them, look, we need additional 100 respondents, and this is the social demographic background that we want to accomplish through this 100 additional 100 participants. So they will be able to do that, and they will help doing data validation as well. And we have a very good experience using this service available at Qualtrics. In addition to Qualtrics online sampling, we're going to do social media-based sampling method. And also we have implemented this method in other projects as well. So basically we will apply do social media ads targeted based upon geographic location, and the respondents will self-identify as they interact with the ad, and then respondents can be screened based upon exclusion criteria in the survey and the demographic quotas. So we can do a soft launch, and check, the social demographic background of the respondents during interim periods, and then change our recruitment strategy a bit through social media. So we can basically say that, the second phase of the survey will target, for example, low-income population only. So we'll have screen questions at the beginning of the survey so that we can screen out high-income respondents. The research team is responsible for data validation. We will not have help from Qualtrics to do this type of whenever we use social media sampling. So we're going to implement the online survey, as I mentioned earlier, through social media outreach as well as Qualtrics online sampling panels. For the data analysis, so we will do regression analysis with the dependent variable as the safety concerns, perception and preferences provided by the self-reported by the 1,000 greater Minnesota residents. And then the explanatory variable will include the geographic location, their demographic attributes, socioeconomic status, mobility service type, as well as the trip characteristics. So we will be able to provide information, what type of population group among rural residents are more likely to have safety concerns. So then, you can imagine that we can make a number of recommendations in terms of which population group we want to target, in terms of mitigate their safety concerns, and then what kind of measures we should use in order to make people feel safe to take transit again. Task number 5 is very important because we want to develop the end product of the project. It needs to be implementable recommendations to transit agencies and shared mobility providers, so that they could use in their day-to-day operation to reduce fuel and bring back users, transit users as well as shared mobility users. Task 6 is just the documentation of our results. So with that, I welcome any questions you might have. Again, we are at a very early stage of this project, so any recommendation or feedback you have will help us greatly improve the strategies that we're going to use as well as our research design. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Yingling. It looks like you do have a question specific to your project. There's a question: will higher income riders still be able to complete the survey, I guess is what they're asking.
Yes, so our experience with the survey, I would say survey recruitment, is that typically lower income population are more difficult to reach. So that's why I used the example that if we got enough high income and middle class residents to participate in the survey, we probably needed to focus on the low income segment to ensure that we have our survey results will be representative of the greater Minnesota residential population.
Great. I had actually a question maybe for Susie and Scudder, which is in your discussions with transit agencies, I guess, how much are people still in the triage, trying to figure things out stage versus how much are agencies now focusing on planning for the future or thinking beyond COVID?
I can start, but I actually haven't spoken as much with transit agencies kind of more recently, so that kind of up-to-date question that you're asking. But one thing I think it's important to keep in mind is that the transit agencies aren't necessarily planning on like a month timescale, right? They're planning over a several year timescale. And so COVID has certainly been very disruptive, but I think that there's, to some extent, it's like a temporary challenge, I guess, and then it will be overcome.
I definitely agree that most agencies are in normal times trying to plan for mostly in terms of years. Obviously, service planning is often maybe a half-yearly exercise for some agencies, but even then, your eye is on a multi-year plan for improvement or expansion or just maintaining your network as best you can. And yeah, COVID disrupted that dramatically for most agencies at the beginning of the process. I would say for most agencies that we communicate with regularly, most were in kind of just complete crisis mode through the summer and beginning of the fall. Most mid to small size agencies, I think, after the first 2 COVID relief bills brought significant funding balance to them, kind of got into a fairly reasonable, manageable groove of managing their service and the ridership. Obviously, the daily operations were always a bit of a challenge in normal times, and more so as operators got COVID or contact tracing required operators go out. Larger agencies many of them have remained in some kind of a kind of crisis mode. I would point to WMATA here, where I am in Northern Virginia, as up until the last COVID relief bill, they were looking at a massive fiscal cliff, and so we're very much in some way, shape, or form in a kind of a crisis planning mode for up until very recently. So it's a bit different depending on the agency.
And are in that kind of longer term planning, are they adjusting what they think the world will look like, or are they just kind of moving ahead with plans the way they were before and seeing how things shake out?
I think that's the $1 million question. I think most agencies are trying to work under the assumption that in, another 6 months to a year, most of life returns to normal and a lot of demand patterns return to something approaching normal with, the understanding that likely work from home flexibility will be a lot higher. And so peak demand is likely to be less than it was in the past. Just because, anything else, any other assumption is just guesswork. We really have no guidelines.
Yeah, it seems a lot of the changes that, like the one thing that we did learn from talking to some transit agencies a little while back is that some of the safety measures that have been taken into play, like for the driver specifically, like installing barriers and things like that, that those things are likely to stick around because they do offer, protections that are helpful, and those are, physical things that have been installed on vehicles, whereas some of the other changes, maybe like fare-free transit, is a temporary way to deal with some of the COVID issues, but not something that may be sustainable, across the board. Some transit agencies have a, better potential to be fare-free, whereas others don't.
Okay, well, it looks like we are at time for the webinar. So I want to thank our speakers again for joining us today and sharing their knowledge and wisdom and giving us a new perspective to start thinking about planning for the future. For our Greater Minnesota Transit agencies, be on the lookout for more outreach from Yingling's research team as we look to put together this research to help you. And I think it'll be very helpful also for the rest of the country, especially as we look at rural and small urban providers, how they can adapt to the situation of trying to get riders back after COVID. And if you missed any of this, we will be posting the recording on our transit page, and all invitees will get a link to that in the next couple of days. So thank you again for joining us, for the speakers, and we look forward to seeing everybody back here in May for our next webinar.